You know, when we picture the First Crusade, what comes to mind? It's usually knights, right? Pious warriors, driven by their faith on a holy mission to reclaim Jerusalem. But what if that's only half the story? What if the real fuse for this explosion wasn't just in the Holy Land, but was actually a crisis that was tearing Europe apart from the inside? Let's get into it.
So in 1095, Pope Urban II gives what might be one of the most important speeches in all of history. And this line is the absolute heart of it. He's not just talking to the saints here. He's calling out to the violent, the outcasts, the robbers of his time, and he's offering them a whole new job description.
And that's the real question, isn't it? Why was 11th century Europe just overflowing with these violent armed men? See, to understand why so many people answered the call for a crusade, you first have to understand the world they were trying to escape, a society that was, frankly, on the brink of completely destroying itself.
So let's set the scene in Western Europe around this time. It wasn't some peaceful, idyllic land. It was a pressure cooker. It was just this ticking time bomb of violence, of hunger, of total social breakdown, just waiting for someone to give it a release.
And that quote, that's not from some later historian, that's from Pope Urban's speech itself. He's describing the daily reality for people in places like France. Any kind of central power had totally collapsed, so you just have these local lords waging endless private wars against each other. The roads were a death trap, villages were constantly being looted, life was nasty, brutish, and short.
So, what's fueling all this chaos? Well, a huge piece of the puzzle, maybe the biggest piece, comes down to a fundamental and disastrous change in how families worked. Specifically, how a father passed down his land.
The new system was called primogeniture, and it's simple and it's brutal. Instead of carving up the family estate for all your kids, everything, the land, the title, the power, it all goes to the firstborn son. So, what about son number 2, or 3, or 4? Well, they get nothing.
So the old way, which was called gavelkind, it divided the land among all the sons. Which sounds fair, but over a few generations, it would splinter a powerful estate into a bunch of tiny, weak farms. Primogeniture fixed that problem by keeping the family land and power all in one piece. But in solving one problem, it created a massive new one. Suddenly, you have this brand new social class, professionally trained killers, knights, with zero land, zero money, and zero prospects. Their only skill is fighting, so their only way to make a life for themselves is to take one from somebody else. And this just unleashes a firestorm of private warfare across the countryside as these landless knights roam around trying to carve out a fortune with the edge of a sword.
And look, this violence, it was personal and it was unbelievably vicious. This account right here gives you a stomach-turning look into that world. This isn't organized war. This is a non-stop cycle of ambush, revenge, and mutilation. This is the world that made Pope Urban's robbers.
But while this crisis was boiling over in places like France, one group of people had already found a solution. A very successful and very violent solution. The Normans. They basically created the blueprint for what these other land-hungry sons could do.
I mean, the Normans were masters of this game. Down in Italy, a bunch of mercenaries became conquerors. A guy named Robert Guiscard, himself one of 12 sons, by the way, conquers southern Italy. And of course, in 1066, William the Conqueror takes all of England and just hands out the land to his followers. The message to every landless knight in Europe was crystal clear. Conquest works.
And if you need one person, one face to put to this whole theory, it's this guy, Bohemond of Taranto. He was the son of that great conqueror, Robert Guiscard, but he was disinherited. So here he is, powerful, ambitious, a brilliant warrior, and totally landless. When he heard the Pope's call for a crusade, you bet he saw a holy mission. But he also saw the opportunity of a lifetime to go get a kingdom for himself, which is exactly what he did.
But this wasn't just about the knights. The desperation went all the way down the social ladder. The whole society was stretched to its breaking point. Not enough land, not enough food, and that made the idea of a rich, fertile, faraway land sound pretty good to just about everyone.
And again, don't take my word for it. Pope Urban himself spells it out. This wasn't some hidden subtext. This was literally part of his sales pitch. He stood up in front of this massive crowd and said, "Look, this land can't support you anymore. There's not enough food, and that's why you're killing each other." He was presenting the East not just as a holy land, but as the solution to their very real earthly problems.
For the average person, life was just grim. Life expectancy was maybe 30. A couple bad harvests in a row, which they had in the 1090s, meant actual starvation. And on top of that, you lived in constant fear of those private wars we talked about. So when you hear about a land flowing with milk and honey, well, even a ridiculously dangerous journey starts to look like a pretty good option.
So the case seems closed, right? The First Crusade was just a giant pressure valve, a colonial land grab dressed up in the language of religion, driven by landless sons and starving peasants. It's a really compelling argument, but what if a huge part of it is just wrong?
Because if the crusade was really just a get-rich-quick scheme, you'd expect the evidence to back that up, right? Well, this is where modern historians started to dig in and found some pretty big holes in that whole theory.
Take a look at this number, 150,000. That's roughly how many individuals the historian Jonathan Riley Smith was able to study. By painstakingly analyzing thousands of charters, letters, and records, his research completely flipped our understanding of who the average crusader really was.
So that whole theory about landless younger sons? Turns out that data doesn't support it. Riley Smith found that the vast majority of knights who went were established lords of their own estates, not the disinherited. And, far from being cheap, going on crusade was astronomically expensive, costing something like 4 or 5 times a knight's entire annual income. The leaders weren't broke adventurers like Bohemond. They were guys like Raymond of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest men in all of France. They had the most to lose.
Get this, most crusaders had to sell or mortgage their family lands, the very thing they were supposedly desperate for, just to be able to afford the journey. And then, after they captured Jerusalem in 1099, the vast majority of them just turned around and went home. That doesn't look like a colonial invasion. It looks a lot more like an incredibly expensive, incredibly dangerous armed pilgrimage.
So where does that leave us? Was it all about God, or was it all about gold? Well, as it so often is with history, the real answer is it was both. It was a perfect and perfectly violent storm.
These motives weren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they fed each other. The piety, the desire for salvation, the belief they were doing God's work, that was all incredibly real. But so was the desperation, the culture of violence, and the worldly ambition.
The First Crusade happened at this unique moment in history, where all these immense social pressures, the land hunger, the violence, the poverty, found a release valve that also happened to be the highest act of Christian piety imaginable. Pope Urban didn't create these forces. He was just a genius at channeling them. He gave a generation of violent men a holy justification for their worldly skills and desires.
And that's really the big question the First Crusade leaves us with. When a deep-seated religious belief also happens to offer a perfect solution to your most desperate earthly problems, is it even possible to pull those two motivations apart?